my line of work doing solutions for the government, one thing that we encounter is a set of requirements that are coming from the government today that require virtualization, they need capacity management, they need a bunch of different solutions. And so one thing that open source allows us to do is that it gives us a wide variety of available choices to put into those solutions. So whether it's a cloud solution, virtualization, capacity management, there's a bunch of different options available to us. And so the importance for the government is they need to be more agile. We're seeing that they obviously have cost issues. And so by delivering open source type solutions to them, we're able to now come in and give them a bunch of different options that they previously didn't have. And so I think that the open source community has been driving a lot of the requirements that we're now seeing from the government. You know, they're coming out and saying, we need a public cloud solution, we need a private cloud solution. And so as they get more used to it and as open source itself evolves and becomes more mature, I think we're finding that the government itself is starting to put a lot more emphasis and a lot more value upon that. So, you know, it's the open source initiative, I guess, if you will, at this point, has where it is now isn't anywhere where it was 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, it's going to be completely different. And so I think by the government reaching out and starting to use more open source type solutions, that's going to help enhance not only the open source infrastructure, but also the government's infrastructure as well. You know, I think the government is faced with a challenge of they're growing in that they're adding a lot new functionality, a lot of applications that were previously internal to the government, they're extending to the public, but they have to get a smaller footprint. You know, there's a big push to reduce energy. So in the case of that, the government is looking to find solutions that are going to allow them to have less data centers. There are agencies that in some cases are sharing data now, combining infrastructure together, and in the past, the solutions that we would put forward to them are ones that would require 2 years, billions of dollars, a lot of development, and you hope it works. Whereas now with open source, they're able to kind of pilot some of the solutions. They're able to look at multiple options, bring things in, tweak it, add on to it, and determine the right one in a shorter amount of time that's going to also reduce costs and then reduce some of their footprint. So, you know, we've had cases where we have, like I said, data center sites that we're consolidating, and by closing regional offices, we're leveraging some open source solutions to kind of reduce the cost and make it a lot easier now than it would have been just a couple of years ago. Other ways that we're seeing it have been in terms of a lot of the virtualization space. And so now, from an internal development standpoint, as the government is developing new products and tools, they can rapidly move from a development to a test into a production, and they can be more agile. And that's something that's been prevalent in the public space, but now the government is actually seeing the benefits of open source in the private sector too. I think the government, as they get their hands on anything, they try to put rules and standards around it, and that is going to be important with open source. One thing that I see happening is the government reaching out to the community to put some structure and some guidelines around best practices, some of the standards. We've already seen it in terms of things like ITIL, how that has evolved over time, because it was kind of a best practice for the longest time, and now there's a framework around it. And I think that's going to continue to evolve with open source as we move forward as well. And so, you know, it's the one benefit of, or one of the major benefits of open source is that there's so many players involved in it. And it's a really rapid moving pace. And much like social media these days, what happened 10 minutes ago doesn't matter. And so the government is going to, in my opinion, have an important stake into defining some of the standards, the best practices, and also touching on some of the security. There's, you know, thoughts that open source in general is less secure because it's, you know, so openly available, obviously by nature. But I think as the government starts to use it more and as an active player involved in it, they're going to kind of control some of those standards and be able to influence some of the security concerns. We're seeing cases where, Department of Treasury starting to use open source type solutions as them and other agencies, for example, start to use it. Some of those fears should go away. There's a high demand for the cloud virtualization from what we're seeing. And, as the government tries to expand their functionality to users, one thing is with tax season coming up, the IRS is going to be in heavy demand just for data. And so the importance of using open source is going to grow exponentially. And so it's important, I think, for the government to plan ahead, think about the trends that they're going to see, put together a plan to build out solutions that use open source, and then test them, go back, modify, and continue to just be involved, be a contributor in the open source communities to help kind of drive change. Because I think that if you were to go back, they were talking about this in the keynotes earlier, back to 2008 when cloud computing itself kind of got formed and got the adopted name and people started looking at it. And compared to where we're at now, we kind of knew where we were coming, but the terminology and the comfort wasn't there. And so if the government is an active leader, I think, in open source, it's going to help not only the government's use of open source, but just open source in general, where we are 3 years or 5 years from now. And so kind of taking the models that they've had in place to where they did software development before and using the same logic just with open source, where it's going to be quicker, it's going to be more agile, it's going to be more cost efficient, I think will help evolve us to 2 years from now and to what is the next big thing. And so, one thing we're trying to push forward is that, when a solution comes in, people will often ask me, what's my area of expertise? And my default answer is that I'm a Unix person by default. But the real answer is that, I'm kind of a jack of all trades. We look at many different solutions: security, storage, networking. And so I think that logic and concept, instead of, all right, if we need a solution for a certain software application, it's not going to be just one choice. There's going to be multiple choices out there. And as the government starts to use them more, hopefully they'll become kind of a driver and a leader in open source.